Scott Pilgrim, the previously digital-only poster child for games preservation that was famously delisted in 2014, returned to digital storefronts this week. But it's far from the only game to have been sent to the binary graveyard. Just this month, 250 of the 448 DSiWare games available on Nintendo 3DS's eShop were pulled down without warning before being relisted again. Looking broadly across all platforms, delistedgames.com claims a total of 1,178 titles have disappeared from digital storefronts and are no longer available to purchase. I don't expect any of them to get the Scott Pilgrim treatment. Why do games get delisted though? In many cases, including Scott Pilgrim's, the games are licensed titles from properties including 007, Transformers, and a whole pile of Marvel games. Games publishers need a license to create and sell games based on an existing property. Sometimes they pitch to the rights holder, other times the franchise owner will approach them. When that license inevitably expires, there will be a negotiation to renew that contract. If the game's not making enough money, either party's unhappy with how it was made, reviewed, marketed, etc., or another publisher now has the exclusive games license to that franchise, the license ends and the titles can no longer be sold. The other main reason games get delisted is a lot more harrowing and concerning. When Nintendo closed the Wii Shop channel, every single WiiWare game disappeared with it. That's 463 games you can no longer purchase or download. Granted, not every WiiWare game was exclusive to that platform, but it was still a considerable loss, which included the likes of Contra Rebirth. This is something that will continue happening. Nintendo have already closed the 3DS and Wii U eShops in 42 countries. Sony have stopped listing PlayStation 3, Portable, and Vita games on its web store. Those are now only accessible directly from those consoles' PlayStation Store apps. Why should we care though? These are old games, nobody's buying or playing them anymore, right? Speaking personally, I still fire up my Mega Drive regularly and enjoy some of those games as much as any PlayStation 5 title. But then, I was there at the time, I have nostalgia for these older platforms, so maybe I'm biased. I also have an 8-year-old daughter and 6-year-old son. When the latest trailer for new Pokemon Snap released, my kids spent the rest of the day excitedly playing the Nintendo 64 original. My kids definitely weren't around during the N64's heyday, and yet they find a lot of value in old games. As a parent, I also love sharing those experiences with them. There's also a historical and record-keeping aspect to it. Scott Pilgrim draws heavy inspiration from beat-em-ups that came before it. Renegade, Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, Final Fight, River City Ransom, Turtles in Time, the list goes on. In turn, the amazingly fun River City Girls seems to have then taken some cues from Scott. Having access to these older games is vital for inspiring and influencing the next generation of games developers. For many, the issue of digital storefronts and vanishing licenses has a very simple solution: physical releases. In fact, most of the examples I mentioned earlier have real-world discs or cartridges you can still buy second-hand and play. People are generally ecstatic that the re-release of Scott Pilgrim includes a physical version. Albeit from limited run, with massive postage costs to Europe, on orders they'll be fulfilling in 4 to 5 months, on what will likely be a single print run that will never return. So if you miss this window, or, like most people, didn't know about it because you're not a hardcore enthusiast, prepare to pay silly amounts from resellers later on. Yay! Physical releases aren't a silver bullet either. At the risk of repeating some of my physical versus digital video, many games have a day one patch, additional DLC, or don't include the full game and require you to download up to 2/3 of it. Let's pick on third-party Switch games this time to avoid moaning about Spyro again. Other games, even single-player ones, require a constant internet connection for leaderboards, anti-cheat measures, and digital rights management, aka DRM, aka making sure you're playing a legally owned copy of the game at all times. Why's that a problem? Well, here and now, people have restrictive download limits, unreliable connections, or slow speeds thanks to varying population density, potential return on investment, a general lack of regulation, and corporate greed. You know, good old capitalism. In the future, people wanting to experience what will then be retro games will find the relevant servers no longer exist, and they can't complete those vital required downloads and authentication checks. Some games, like a certain Purple Dragons, get reprinted with all of the content and updates included, but good luck telling the difference between the incomplete Day 1 disc and the version you actually want. Other titles get so-called complete editions, but sometimes it's just a vanilla disc with a slip of paper containing a one-time use only download code for the aforementioned digital storefronts that won't be around forever. Oh, and the codes usually have an expiry date too. To give a fairly recent example, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 is available physically on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, but those discs don't contain the DLC characters which you can no longer buy, and those versions of the games don't perform as well as the later digital releases on PS4, which are no longer available for purchase. Those issues simply aren't present in older games. My Sega Saturn's never had to worry about patches and DLC, but it does have to worry about wear and tear. The disk drive, especially the laser, will give out eventually, assuming the board's capacitors don't leak first. Finding working first-party controllers for older consoles is also increasingly difficult and expensive, although in the Saturn's case we now have new licensed pads. Discs get scratched or damaged, cartridge pins can corrode, internal batteries need replacing, anyone who's owned a Pokemon game knows that firsthand. Even if you take care of your games, media rot is an inevitable natural occurrence that's gonna get you sooner or later. These problems have brought about a variety of solutions from the gaming community. The first I want to discuss is emulation. This is software for your PC that mimics a video game console, allowing you to play that system's games on your computer. In an attempt to avoid legal issues, emulators are often open source, meaning anyone can contribute to them, and they're also clean room projects, meaning they don't reuse any code from the original systems. Emulators generally have two problems people bring up: compatibility and accuracy. Some games will recognize they're not playing on real hardware and refuse to run thanks to anti-piracy measures. Some games use hardware in unexpected and innovative ways that pull off special effects which an emulator can't replicate properly. There are also things that impact entire libraries of games. For example, many players cite input lag on emulators, meaning you don't jump immediately when you press a button. Older games ran at 59.3Hz on a CRT TV. They're now trying to play back at 60 frames per second on a PC monitor, causing minor frame pacing issues and meaning the gameplay speed might not be an exact match to the original hardware. That said, emulation has long been used in official re-releases and compilations of games. You have PS2 classics from the PSN store on PS3, 4, and 5, the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection, the endless Mega Drive compilation, seriously Sega, can we get some Saturn or Dreamcast? Every mini or classic console that's come out over the past few years uses it too. It's a lightweight, versatile, relatively inexpensive solution that can even offer enhancements, such as increasing the render resolution of 3D titles. Emulation is even used to recreate old titles. We thought we'd never get a remaster of Final Fantasy VIII because the source code was lost and the entire game had to be reverse engineered. In behind-the-scenes videos about our old friend the Spyro Reignited trilogy, which I swear is on its way to becoming a channel meme at this point, they openly admit to not having the source code and instead making a tool called the Spyroscope. This allowed them to inspect the original trilogy's values and structure while running them under emulation to replicate the original's mechanics as closely as possible. These projects, and many others, probably wouldn't have happened without emulation. For those of you who demand accuracy beyond the capabilities of emulation, there are a few more solutions. Flash carts allow you to run games from an SD card on the original hardware. I personally have EverDrives for my Mega Drive, Nintendo 64, and Game Boy Advance. These allow me to have the console's entire library on a single cartridge, meaning there's no wear and tear on the console's pins from removing and inserting different physical games. In a similar fashion, we have ODEs, optical drive emulators. These replace your console's disk drive with an SD card slot and again lets you run games from there. This avoids the wear and tear that will eventually see disk drives fail. I have one in my Dreamcast, and I'm eyeing up potential solutions for my Saturn and PlayStation 1. Of course, the dream would be for some absolute mad lads to just manufacture entirely new consoles. Oh wait, they did! For those with the money, products like Analog's Mega SG are very tempting when they're actually in stock. These newly manufactured consoles use field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs, to far more closely mimic original hardware, in this case, the Mega Drive. Of course, while emulators, flashcards, and ODEs might technically be legal, the copies of games you play on them probably aren't. An emulator runs a ROM or ISO. This is a digital backup of a game you can download from the internet and play. Now, at no point have you actually bought the game you're downloading. Even if you purchased the original disc or cartridge, you usually only have a license to play that piece of physical media on the hardware it was intended for in a private setting. You're not allowed to reproduce it, reverse engineer it, or even broadcast it. Yeah, I know Twitch exists, I'm just not sure how. Look, it's kind of beside the point, okay? The counter-argument is often one of who cares and who's actually going to prosecute. Now, in the case of, say, Super Mario World, a game that's presently available on Nintendo's current hardware, the Switch, as part of Nintendo's present-day subscription-based online service, the answer's pretty obvious. Even then, Nintendo went after the sites distributing ROMs of their games, not the people who downloaded them. You, as an individual, are unlikely to be pursued. I'll stress here that I'm not a lawyer and this isn't legal advice. What I'm about to describe is my limited personal interpretation of the relevant laws and situation. It costs companies money to take you to court. It's their lawyers' time, there's legal fees, there's potential reputational damage if the community deems the action immoral, not that it's ever stopped Nintendo, so it needs to be worth their time. They need damages from you, and those damages need to significantly outweigh the costs of pursuing it. They could claim loss of profits, and here it makes sense to go after the ROM distributor who facilitated millions of downloads rather than the individuals who downloaded them. Reputational damage, which, let's face it, you're not going to cause by privately playing a ROM in an emulator, or something like revealing trade secrets or infringing on intellectual property rights, which, again, is probably not going to apply to you personally unless you're manually reverse engineering and releasing the game's source code or something. That's for Super Mario World, where the game's still being sold. Well, in a sense, this video isn't about the pros and cons of virtual console purchases versus a Nintendo Online subscription. That's a separate video altogether, and the rights owner is easily identifiable. Let's pretend I've downloaded and am now playing a ROM of Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage on the Mega Drive. Sorry, panels to pixels. Who's going to take me to court? Marvel Comics, the license holder? Sega of America? Software Creations, the developer? I mean, they later became Acclaim Studios Manchester before Acclaim then filed for bankruptcy in 2004. The publisher? Oh wait, no, that was Acclaim and we just discussed their fate. For argument's sake, we'll say I'm taken to court for pirating Maximum Carnage. Can they prove loss of earnings? No, the game's not available for purchase. Sure, I can get a used copy on eBay, but that money goes to the private seller. The game's developers, publishers, and license holders wouldn't see a single penny from that sale. I mean, if anything, the eBay resellers are the real crooks here, but let's not get into that. Sorry, back on track. The game's unlikely to ever return to storefronts, physically or digitally. While the rights to Marvel games don't seem to be exclusive if Insomniac's able to develop Spider-Man games, while Camouflage release Iron Man VR and Crystal Dynamics push out Avengers, the original developers and publishers of Maximum Carnage simply don't exist anymore. There's no compelling business case for other companies to pick it up either, as commercially, the cost of licensing it, emulating it on modern platforms, adding support for trophies, and listing it on various storefronts doesn't provide a significant return on investment, which, ultimately, is all companies care about. They're here to make money, they don't care about preserving history. That's why it often falls to the community. In a similar manner, the community picks up localization projects that weren't deemed to be commercially viable. I can play the PS2 exclusive Namco Cross Capcom in English thanks to a dedicated team of fans who released their own translation. I can even play that on original hardware thanks to a PS2 hard drive mod and FreeMac boot. If they were to provide an official release, I'd happily buy that, but the closest thing we've had so far is Project Cross Zone on the 3DS. Another benefit for me is that I live in a PAL region. Our retro games ran at 50Hz. For the most part, we didn't get options for 60Hz until the Dreamcast and PS2 era, before things eventually got standardized globally in the PS3 and Xbox 360 era. This means our games often ran slower, at weird interlaced resolutions, while US and Japanese gamers more regularly enjoyed progressive scan options. Our releases are generally considered to be inferior to their NTSC counterparts, but these community efforts and tools have given me access to those now. In the interest of balance, I should point out old games do resurface. The Lion King and Aladdin re-release even got a physical form, and those efforts need to be supported if you want to see more of them. Buying things like the Arcade Archive series, Wild Guns Reloaded, and the Collection of Mana shows games companies we want these titles to be preserved, and we're willing to pay for them. Sadly, those are the exceptions rather than the rule. In the meantime, I'll continue to rely on emulators, flashcards, ODEs, and other community efforts, because it's clear I can't trust the industry to do enough about the issue. Their focus is on the sales made during those crucial first 8 weeks of a game's release. They make as much money as they can, and then they move on. I wouldn't say I begrudge that, it's the nature of competitive business for profit, but at the same time, I'm not going to feel guilty about using whichever avenues I have to in order to enjoy abandoned software from years gone by, and neither should you. Okay, that was a longer discussion video than I thought it'd be. Honestly, I ended up having more to say than I expected. I still think there's this weird disconnect between legality and morality sometimes, and I do think a lot of copyright laws and intellectual property rights were conceived and drafted up at a very different time, before the internet and everything else, and I do think they need to be modernized. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on this. It's definitely two very valid sides to a debate, and I always welcome other points of view that, challenge me and give me something to chew on. So with that in mind, sound off in the comments, and I will catch you in the next video.